Ambassador Elias Carter stood in the docking bay of the Zenith capital, exhaling slowly. The air here smelled artificial, infused with metallic sterility and faint traces of incense, a scent meant to intimidate, to remind visitors that they were at the mercy of the Dominion's hospitality. The towering spires of the alien metropolis loomed in the distance, jagged and cruel, reflecting the Dominion's philosophy of strength through dominance. Elias adjusted his ceremonial uniform, his fingers brushing against the small Terran emblem stitched onto his chest. He had spent years negotiating peace across the stars, always believing in diplomacy, always believing that words could prevent war. This was his greatest test yet. The Zenith Dominion was vast, ruthless, and unyielding. Humanity had fought them to a bloody stalemate, proving that Earth was no mere upstart species. This meeting, the first diplomatic encounter between a human representative and the Dominion's High Council, was supposed to signal a shift. A recognition that the Zenith could not win through force alone. Elias walked forward, flanked by his escort of Terran security personnel. The reptilian soldiers at the entrance barely spared them a glance, their clawed hands resting lazily on the grips of their plasma rifles. They didn't see humans as a threat here, not within the heart of their empire. He had seen that arrogance before. The massive golden doors of the grand hall rumbled open, revealing a vast chamber adorned with towering obsidian columns and glowing, intricate glyphs carved into the floor. The High Council sat on an elevated dais, draped in flowing, jewel-encrusted robes. Their golden eyes, slit-pupilled and unblinking, regarded him with a mix of amusement and disdain. At the center of them all sat Chancellor Verkol, his scaled features impassive, his presence exuding power. His black ceremonial robes bore the sigils of his lineage, markings that symbolized centuries of bloodshed, conquest, and dominion over lesser species. Elias forced himself to meet those pitiless eyes. Ambassador Carter, Verkol intoned, his voice deep, rich, and utterly devoid of warmth. A man of words among creatures of action. A dangerous place to be. Elias offered a slight nod. Words can do what war cannot, Chancellor. They build bridges instead of burning them. The councillors chuckled, a low, guttural sound. You assume we desire bridges, Councillor Zerlin said, his crimson-scaled fingers drumming lazily against the arm of his throne. You assume that peace is in our interest. Elias had anticipated this. He had spent countless nights preparing his arguments, refining his approach. He had studied their history, their traditions, their power struggles. The Dominion ruled through fear, through absolute control, but they were not invincible. Humanity had already proven that. I assume, Elias said carefully, that the Dominion is not blind to reality. The war has cost you resources, soldiers, and territory. You are strong, yes. But even the strong must recognize when war ceases to be profitable. Verkol tilted his head, considering him. Elias pressed on. We propose an armistice. Trade agreements. Mutual access to neutral zones. A future where we do not waste lives in endless battle. Silence stretched through the hall. Elias could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the tension thick in the air. He held his ground, standing tall despite the quiet menace radiating from the council. Then Verkol smiled. It was a slow, deliberate gesture, utterly devoid of mirth. An intriguing proposition, Ambassador, he said. Indeed, this meeting is historic. The doors behind Elias slammed shut with a deafening boom. His stomach dropped. The energy shield surrounding his security detail flickered, then died. Remotely overridden. Before his guards could react, plasma fire erupted from hidden gun emplacements within the columns. Screams of agony filled the hall. Elias turned, horror gripping him as his men were cut down in a storm of energy bolts. Their bodies convulsed, burned, then crumpled into smoking heaps on the pristine marble floor. The acrid scent of charred flesh filled the air. Elias spun back toward the council, his heart pounding. You. Zerlin had already risen from his throne, stepping forward with slow, measured steps. In his clawed grip, a ceremonial blade crackled to life, its edge pulsing with violet energy. You came to teach us the value of peace, Zerlin mused. Instead, let us teach you, there is no peace among the stars. Only strength. Elias clenched his fists. Humanity will never bow to you. Verkol smirked. They won't have to. They will fear us instead. A hovering camera drone descended from the ceiling, its lens zooming in on Elias. Broadcasting. Beaming his final moments across the Dominion's controlled networks. They wanted the entire galaxy to witness this execution. They wanted to make an example of him. Zerlin's blade was a blur. The searing heat of the energy weapon sliced clean through Elias Carter's neck. His body crumpled before his head even hit the floor. A pool of blood spread across the ornate tiles beneath him, staining the pristine golden surface. The camera drone lingered on the fallen diplomat for a long moment before slowly panning back up to the council. Verkol turned to face the lens, his expression impassive. This is the fate of those who challenge the Dominion. Let it serve as a warning to any who would defy our rule. Across the galaxy, billions watched in stunned silence. Some cheered. Others recoiled in horror. And on a distant world, a man sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists, his breath slow and controlled. Declan Carter had tried to leave violence behind. But now, war had found him again. And the Zenith Dominion had no idea what was coming. The dim light of the bar barely reached the corner where Declan Carter sat, a glass of amber liquid untouched in front of him. The place reeked of alcohol, sweat, and quiet desperation. It was the kind of establishment that existed on the fringes of civilization, where mercenaries, ex-soldiers, and criminals nursed their wounds, both physical and otherwise. Declan had spent the last 3 years here, drifting from one nameless world to another, trying to forget the war, the violence, and the blood he'd spilled. He had been good at it. Too good. Once, he had been a soldier. Special forces. The best of the best. But when the war against the Zenith Dominion erupted, the government had asked for something more. A new kind of warrior. A specialist in deep infiltration, assassination, and unconventional warfare. They had turned him into a ghost. A weapon. But Declan had walked away. He had buried that part of himself, trying to find some semblance of peace. And then, in one moment, the Dominion had ripped that peace away. The broadcast played on the bar's holoscreen, the same one that had been circulating across every known system for the past 24 hours. Elias Carter. His father. Kneeling in the grand hall of the Dominion. Beheaded. Declan didn't react. He had already seen it before, over and over again, the image burning into his mind. The bartender, a grizzled old man with cybernetic implants where his eyes used to be, glanced at him. You knew him, didn't you? Declan exhaled slowly. Yeah. The bartender nodded, wiping the counter with a rag. You gonna do something about it? Declan didn't answer. Because he already knew. There was only one response to an act like this. Retribution. He pushed his chair back, grabbed his coat, and walked out. The warehouse on the outskirts of the city was dimly lit, the hum of old industrial generators filling the silence. The air was thick with oil, metal, and something more dangerous, the scent of men who lived outside the law. Declan stepped through the reinforced doors, his presence drawing immediate attention. A dozen mercenaries sat around, some cleaning weapons, others engaged in quiet conversations. The moment they saw him, the room shifted. Men tensed. Hands moved toward holsters. They knew who he was. At the center of the room, a towering man with cybernetic arms and a scarred face leaned against a crate. Callum Voss. Ex-military. A legend among mercenaries. Declan Carter, Voss said, smirking. Didn't think I'd see you again. I need weapons, Declan said. A ship. Intel on the Dominion's capital. Voss raised an eyebrow. That's a hell of an ask. You planning a suicide mission? Declan's expression didn't change. No. I'm planning a massacre. The room fell into a stunned silence. Voss studied him for a long moment before chuckling. Well, shit. If I were a betting man, I'd say the Dominion is in for a bad week. He gestured toward the crates. Take what you need. The ship Declan chose was a modified stealth frigate, fast and armed to the teeth. He sat in the cockpit, calibrating the weapon systems as Voss entered, carrying a data pad. Got something for you, Voss said, tossing the pad onto the console. Blueprints of the Grand Hall. Guard rotations. Entry points. Everything you need. Declan scanned the data. How did you get this? Voss smirked. Let's just say the Dominion isn't as invincible as they like to pretend. Declan nodded. Appreciate it. Voss hesitated. You sure about this? You're gonna have every Zenith warlord in the sector hunting you down after this. Declan's eyes were cold. Let them come. Voss exhaled. Well, in that case, make it brutal. Declan strapped himself into the pilot seat. I intend to. With a flick of a switch, the engines roared to life, and the ship shot into the darkness of space. The Zenith capital world shimmered beneath him as he activated the ship's cloaking system. It was a fortress, a planet covered in citadels, warships, and planetary defenses. But Declan wasn't going in as an invader. He was going in as a ghost. Slipping past their outer defenses, he landed in a maintenance sector on the planet's surface. From here, it was all about stealth. Dressed in dark combat armor, he moved through the underbelly of the city, avoiding patrols, using shadows like old friends. His approach was calculated, every step designed to bring him closer to his target. The Grand Hall. The place where his father had been murdered. 2 Zenarith sentries stood at the entrance of a restricted access tunnel, their plasma rifles held lazily at their sides. Declan struck like lightning. His knife tore through the first guard's throat before the second even had time to react. Blood sprayed onto the walls as he yanked the blade free and drove it into the second sentry's chest. The alien gurgled, clawing at the wound before collapsing. Silent. Efficient. He dragged the bodies into the shadows and kept moving. Inside the Grand Hall's security complex, a group of Zenarith officers monitored the capital's defense grid. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of holoscreens. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. One of the officers frowned, tapping a control panel. What was? A blade pierced his skull from behind. The other officers barely had time to register what was happening before gunfire erupted. Declan moved through them like a spectre, his silenced rifle tearing through bodies. Blood splattered across consoles. The last officer tried to raise the alarm. Declan grabbed him, slamming his head into the control panel. The alien's skull caved in with a sickening crack. Declan wiped the blood from his knife and turned to the main console. He activated a data spike, overriding the security protocols. The defenses of the Grand Hall were now under his control. He wasn't just here to kill the High Council. He was going to burn everything they had built to the ground. The first explosion rocked the city 5 minutes later. Then another. Panic spread like wildfire as the Dominion's elite forces scrambled to respond. But Declan was already inside the Grand Hall, moving through the corridors like death incarnate. Guards fell before they could raise their weapons. A Zenarith officer rounded the corner, screaming for reinforcements. Declan put a bullet through his eye. The closer he got to the council chamber, the more resistance he faced. But it didn't matter. This wasn't a battle. This was execution. And the High Council was about to learn what it meant to make an enemy of a Carter. As he approached the chamber doors, Declan reloaded his rifle and exhaled slowly. This was only the beginning. The Grand Hall's entrance loomed before him, its towering golden doors adorned with intricate carvings of Zenarith victories, countless depictions of conquered worlds, kneeling species, and fallen rulers. It was supposed to be a monument to their supremacy. Declan Carter was about to turn it into a tomb. His pulse was steady. His breathing controlled. He had done this before, slipping through the shadows, eliminating threats with cold efficiency. But this wasn't just another mission. This was retribution. He took one last look at the carnage behind him. Bodies of elite guards sprawled across the marble floors, the scent of burning flesh thick in the air. He reloaded his rifle, checked his blades, and pushed forward. Inside that chamber sat the High Council, the architects of his father's execution. They wouldn't leave this room alive. The moment Declan pressed his palm against the door's biometric panel, alarms blared. The Dominion had finally realized their seat of power was under attack. Too late. The doors slid open with a deep, resonant thud. Declan stepped inside. The council chamber was massive, towering columns, an ornate domed ceiling, and a raised platform where the High Council sat today. Gilded banners of the Dominion hung from the walls, their symbols of power illuminated by floating energy orbs. And at the far end of the chamber, seated in his throne, was Chancellor Verkor. The lizard-like ruler regarded Declan with a calm, almost bemused expression. His golden eyes flickered with recognition. "You have your father's eyes," Verkor mused, voice smooth as silk. "And his delusions." The other councillors tensed, their guards drawing weapons. Declan didn't speak. He raised his rifle. Boom. A single, suppressed shot cracked through the air. The nearest councillor's head snapped back, a hole drilled clean through his skull. His lifeless body slumped in his throne, blood pouring onto the marble. The room exploded into chaos. Guards surged forward, rifles raised. Declan dropped to a knee, firing precise shots that tore through armor and flesh alike. The chamber echoed with the sharp crack of his rifle, punctuated by the shrieks of dying Zenarith elites. One charged him with a blade, roaring in fury. Declan pivoted, catching the alien's arm, twisting until bone shattered with a sickening snap. Before the creature could scream, Declan drove a knife into its throat, tearing sideways in one brutal motion. Blood sprayed across the golden floor. Declan didn't hesitate. He spun, fired twice, one shot to the gut, one to the skull, dropping another guard before he could pull the trigger. The last remaining soldier tried to flee, sprinting toward the exit. Declan shot him in the back of the knee. The alien crumpled, shrieking in agony. Declan walked over and put a round in the back of his head. The chamber fell silent. All that remained were the counselors, frozen in their seats. Declan lowered his rifle slightly, his gaze locking onto Verkol. "You made a mistake," he said quietly. The Chancellor exhaled, unfazed. "Did I?" Declan advanced slowly, boots echoing against the marble. "You think killing my father was a message. You think fear is power. But you don't understand humans." He tilted his head slightly. "We don't fear death. We don't kneel. You've mistaken our patience for weakness." Verkol's golden eyes remained steady. "And yet, you are here alone." Declan smirked. "Am I?" The moment the words left his lips, the chamber trembled. Explosions rocked the city outside, detonations set by Declan's sabotage spreading through the Dominion's most fortified districts. Fires raged beyond the stained glass windows, black smoke curling into the sky. The Dominion wasn't just losing its leaders. It was losing its throne. Councillor Zerlin snarled, lunging from his seat, claws bared. "You think this changes anything?" Declan shot him in the gut. The alien gasped, clutching at the gaping wound, stumbling forward. Declan caught him by the throat. He leaned in close, voice ice cold. "This changes everything." With one violent motion, he twisted Zerlin's head. Snap. The body dropped. The remaining councillors trembled. Declan could see it in their eyes, realization. Understanding. Fear. Only Verkol remained defiant. "You are a fool," the Chancellor said calmly. "You have killed councillors, soldiers, nobles. But the Dominion is eternal. Kill me, and another will take my place. Nothing will change." Declan stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You're right," he admitted. "Nothing changes if I kill you." Verkol's expression flickered, just for a second. Declan holstered his rifle. Instead, he reached for the small device strapped to his belt. A transmitter. A direct signal to the data spike he had planted in the Dominion's network. He pressed the button. In an instant, every Zenith-controlled broadcast in the sector changed. Screens flickered, channels hijacked. The Dominion had paraded Elias Carter's execution across the galaxy. Now, Declan returned the favor. The broadcast showed the council chamber, Verkol and his fellow rulers, trembling in their seats. It showed the bodies littering the floor, the destruction outside. It showed the once mighty rulers of the Dominion, utterly powerless. Across every occupied world, the people watched. On Dominion-controlled slave colonies, prisoners saw their oppressors on their knees. On human worlds, soldiers saw a son delivering vengeance. Declan turned back to Verkol. "Now the entire galaxy sees what happens when you cross us." The Chancellor exhaled slowly. "You think this will break us?" "No," Declan admitted. "But it's the start." He reached into his coat and pulled out something small. A thin, metallic cylinder. Verkol's eyes widened slightly. Declan smiled. "You used one just like this on my father." He pressed the activation button. The plasma blade ignited with a low hum. Verkol didn't move. He didn't beg. He simply watched as Declan raised the blade. Then, in one smooth motion, Declan swung. The Chancellor's head rolled from his shoulders, landing with a dull thud. Blood pooled beneath the throne. The galaxy watched. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the Dominion, rebellions began. Declan stood in the aftermath, his breathing slow, controlled. He turned off the transmitter. The job was done. The Dominion would not fall overnight. There would still be battles, wars, bloodshed. But this? This was the beginning of the end. Declan wiped the blood from his blade, took one last look at his father's killers, and walked away. Behind him, the Grand Hall burned. Declan Carter walked through the smoldering wreckage of the Grand Hall, his boots crunching over broken marble and shattered glass. The Dominion's seat of power was crumbling, flames licking at the golden banners that once hung in triumph. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and death. He had done it. He had executed the High Council. He had broadcast their deaths across every occupied world. And now, the Dominion would feel the weight of their arrogance. But his work wasn't finished. Not yet. The alarms had shifted from warning sirens to all-out emergency klaxons. The Dominion's military had finally coordinated a response. He could hear the distant roar of drop ships, the telltale whine of energy weapons charging up. They were coming. And Declan wasn't done killing. The first wave hit within minutes. Heavy boots pounded against the marble floors, the rhythmic march of Zenith elite soldiers moving in formation. These weren't the ceremonial guards who had lined the halls before, these were war-hardened Dominion commandos. The best the Zenith had to offer. Declan crouched behind a broken pillar, adjusting the sights on his rifle. He counted at least 15, all in reinforced armor, sweeping through the Grand Hall's ruins with lethal precision. They had learned. They weren't underestimating him anymore. Too bad it wouldn't help them. Declan moved like a shadow, slinking through the debris, using the flames and smoke as cover. He waited until the first squad was directly beneath a half-collapsed balcony. Then he struck. A single suppressed shot took out the squad leader, right through the side of the head. Before the body even hit the ground, Declan dropped a fragmentation charge over the edge. Boom. The explosion ripped through the ranks, sending bodies flying. Screams filled the air. He moved fast, weaving through the chaos, picking off survivors with deadly efficiency. One soldier managed to turn his rifle in time. Declan shot him in the elbow, then finished him with a knife to the throat. Blood sprayed across the floor. The last soldier left standing tried to run. Declan caught him by the back of his armor, slammed him face first into a shattered column, and crushed his windpipe with a brutal elbow strike. 15 elite commandos. Dead in under 60 seconds. But more were coming. Declan could hear the thunder of approaching warships. The Dominion was deploying everything they had, heavy gunners, armored walkers, aerial drones. They weren't just trying to kill him. They were trying to erase him. He sprinted through the burning hallways, knowing he needed to reach his escape ship before they cut off his only exit. The Dominion's capital was still in chaos, their own forces scrambling, unsure who was still in charge after the council's execution. That was his only advantage. And he planned to use it. The first armored walker came into view as he reached the courtyard, a towering behemoth of reinforced plating and twin rotary cannons, its sensors sweeping for movement. Infantry moved in squads around it, using it as cover. A direct fight was suicide. So Declan went around it. He scaled the side of a ruined building, using a grappling hook to pull himself onto a high vantage point. From here, he had a clear line of sight to the walker's weakest point, the exposed power conduits on its back. He took the shot. The armor-piercing round punched through the plating, lodging deep in the power core. Sparks flew. The walker's servos screeched as it staggered. Then the second shot came. Boom. The core erupted in a chain reaction, flames engulfing the entire machine. It collapsed forward, crushing several soldiers beneath its massive frame. Panic spread. Declan used the confusion to move, dropping from his perch and cutting through the remaining forces like a ghost in the night. His ship was in sight now, just beyond the docking bay. But between him and the exit stood them. A Zenith warlord, taller than the rest, clad in heavy combat armor, his massive plasma blade humming in the darkness. Commander Zhervac. The Dominion's most feared warrior. And he wasn't alone. Around him stood a dozen more elite soldiers, weapons locked, waiting for Declan to make the first move. Zhervac tilted his head, studying Declan. "You have caused much damage, human," the warlord rumbled. His voice was deep, a low growl that vibrated through the air. "You think your vengeance makes you strong?" Declan kept his rifle raised. "No." He smirked. "But it makes you dead." Then he moved. Gunfire erupted. Declan rolled forward, taking out the first soldier with a brutal shot to the throat. He spun, using the body as cover as energy blasts ripped through the air. A knife flashed, he buried it into another soldier's gut, twisted, and kicked the dying body into the next attacker. A plasma blade swiped at him, he ducked, feeling the heat singe the edge of his armor. His rifle snapped up. Boom. A direct shot to the eye. Zhervac didn't wait. The warlord charged, swinging his massive blade with terrifying force. Declan barely dodged, the energy blade carving a molten scar into the ground where he stood moments before. Zhervac was fast. Too fast for his size. Declan fired twice, one shot glanced off the warlord's armor, the second ricocheted off his reinforced shoulder plating. He needed to get closer. Zhervac swung again. Declan rolled under it, coming up inside the warlord's guard. He drew his combat knife and slashed, only for Zhervac to catch his wrist in a crushing grip. "You die now," the warlord growled. Declan gritted his teeth. "Not today." With his free hand, he pulled a flash charge from his belt and slammed it against the warlord's face. The grenade detonated with a blinding boom. Zhervac roared, releasing him, staggering back as the intense light overloaded his vision. Declan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the warlord's own plasma blade and drove it straight through his chest. Zervac choked, his massive frame convulsing. Declan twisted the blade, severing organs, cutting deep. The warlord shuddered, then collapsed. Dead. The remaining soldiers faltered. Declan didn't give them a chance to recover. He moved, fast and ruthless, cutting them down one by one, until only he was left standing. The docking bay was within reach. Declan sprinted toward his ship, engaging the launch sequence as he vaulted into the cockpit. The engines roared to life, thrusters burning hot. As he lifted off, Dominion warships began to converge, their heavy cannons locking onto his position. Declan didn't panic. He flipped a switch. The moment his ship cleared the docking bay, the explosives he had planted across the capital detonated. Massive fireballs erupted through the city. Towers crumbled. Military command centers were reduced to rubble. The Dominion's throne world burned. Declan watched from the cockpit, breathing hard, hands steady. His father had been murdered in this city. Now, it was nothing but ash. But this wasn't the end. No. The Dominion had more planets. More rulers. More soldiers. And Declan Carter wasn't done. He set a course for the next target. The war had just begun. Declan Carter sat in the cockpit of his ship, blooded but alive, staring at the burning wreckage of the Dominion's throne world shrinking behind him. Explosions still rippled across the surface as his carefully placed detonations continued to collapse key infrastructure. It was a start. But only that. The Dominion was vast. It had ruled the galaxy through terror for centuries. Killing the High Council and razing their capital was a devastating blow, but it wasn't enough to end them. And Declan wasn't interested in just hurting them. He wanted to erase them. His hands gripped the controls, steady as ever. He had set a course for the next target, one that would shatter the Dominion's ability to retaliate. Their war machine. The Wrath of Zenarith was the Dominion's most powerful battleship. A dreadnought the size of a city, it carried enough firepower to level planets. It had been stationed just outside the capital world, patrolling the outer sectors, expecting an attack from rival empires, never from within. But the moment Declan had broadcasted the Council's execution, the ship had changed course, its captain scrambling to re-establish control. That was its mistake. It had left its position, cut off from reinforcements, isolated in deep space. Declan was going to take it. Or destroy it. Either way, it wouldn't belong to the Dominion anymore. As he approached, the dreadnought scanners detected him. His ship was small, an assault-class vessel modified for speed, stealth, and heavy weaponry. A message crackled through his comms. Unidentified vessel, you are entering Dominion-controlled airspace. Power down immediately or be annihilated. Declan smirked. He flicked on the broadcast channel. This is Declan Carter, he said, his voice cold. You killed my father. Silence. Then. Impossible. Declan could hear the hesitation in the officer's voice. Good. Fear was a weapon. I just burned your capital, he continued. I executed your council. You think I can't take a single ship? The officer hesitated. Then the line cut. Declan counted the seconds. Right on cue, the dreadnought's turrets powered up, its shields activating in full force. They weren't taking chances. Neither was he. Declan's ship moved like a viper, dodging the first volley of plasma rounds with sharp, precise maneuvers. He accelerated toward the dreadnought at full speed, weaving through the storm of incoming fire. A direct assault was suicide. So he didn't attack from the outside. He infiltrated. At the last second, he pulled a sharp dive, skimming along the dreadnought's hull. Before the targeting systems could lock on, he ejected from the cockpit, his body launching into space, magnetized boots latching onto the ship's surface. His vessel, still set to full speed, continued forward, crashing into one of the dreadnought's external hangars in a massive explosion. A distraction. Declan moved fast, cutting through the hull with a plasma torch. Within moments, he slipped inside, vanishing into the ship's dark corridors. Now, the real fight began. The Wrath of Zenarith was a fortress. Corridors stretched endlessly, lined with elite guards, automated turrets, and security drones. The Dominion had spared no expense in protecting their greatest weapon. It didn't matter. Declan moved like death itself, a ghost slipping through the ship, eliminating targets before alarms could even be triggered. One by one, the guards fell. A snapped neck in the shadows. A knife driven through the throat. A silenced shot to the base of the skull. Blood slicked the metallic floors, bodies left to rot in the darkness. The further he moved, the more brutal he became. This wasn't just a mission. This was war. And he was winning. The Dreadnought's command bridge was massive, a sprawling control center filled with high-ranking officers and technicians scrambling to recover from the chaos Declan had caused. When he entered, weapons drawn, time seemed to freeze. All eyes turned to him. One of the officers, a decorated Zenith admiral, rose from his seat. "You?" the alien rasped, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're just one man." Declan smiled. "That's all it takes." Then he opened fire. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. Declan's bullets tore through flesh, his blades carved through armor, his movements a blur of violence. The officers tried to flee, some reaching for weapons, others diving for cover. It didn't matter. They all died. The last to fall was the admiral, who tried to crawl away, blood pooling from a shattered leg. Declan grabbed him by the throat, lifting him effortlessly. "I want you to deliver a message," Declan said, his voice deadly calm. The admiral coughed, choking on his own blood. What? "Tell your people that the Dominion is dying." Declan's grip tightened. "Tell them I'm coming for every last one of you." Then, with a brutal snap, he crushed the admiral's windpipe and let the body fall. The ship was his. Declan moved to the command console, his hands flying over the controls. He accessed the Dominion's network, scanning through their fleet communications. There were dozens of warships still out there, spread across the galaxy, scrambling to respond to the fall of the capital. Good. He activated the Dreadnought's transmitters, hijacking the Dominion's emergency broadcast systems, just as he had done before. Every occupied world, every Dominion-controlled station, every remaining warship. They all saw him. Declan Carter, standing over the bodies of the Dominion's greatest commanders, aboard their most powerful vessel. "This ship belongs to me now," he said, his voice echoing across the galaxy. "And I'm coming for the rest." The transmission cut. And the war truly began. Declan didn't hesitate. He set the ship's coordinates for the Dominion's next stronghold, one of their most vital supply chains. With a single command, the Dreadnought's engines roared to life, breaking free from its position, heading toward the heart of enemy territory. The Dominion had spent centuries conquering. Now, it was his turn. He was no longer just Elias Carter's son. He was vengeance. And he would burn the Dominion to the ground.